order.
I am invoking my Fourth Amendment right.
Stop resisting and get out!
I am a federal judge. This is unlawful.
Hands behind your back.
The federal agents didn't knock. They didn't announce themselves properly. They just surrounded her car in the courthouse parking garage and demanded she prove she belonged in America. The woman sitting in the driver's seat wasn't a criminal. She wasn't an undocumented immigrant. She was Judge Diane Richardson, a federal judge with 23 years on the bench, and the next 72 hours would expose a catastrophic failure that would eventually cost the government $8.3 million. Judge Richardson had just finished a long day presiding over cases. Complex litigation involving securities fraud that required her full attention for 9 straight hours. She was exhausted, looking forward to getting home, maybe having a glass of wine and catching up on reading she'd been putting off all week. Her briefcase sat in the passenger seat filled with case files. Her judicial robes hung in the back. Everything about her screamed federal judge except apparently the color of her skin. The agents appeared from nowhere, 3 of them surrounding her vehicle before she could even process what was happening. One positioned himself directly in front of her car, another at her driver's side window, the third blocking any potential exit from behind. They wore tactical gear with agency insignia she immediately recognized. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The lead agent, a man in his mid-30s with mirror sunglasses despite being in a parking garage, tapped aggressively on her window. Judge Richardson rolled it down halfway, her legal mind already cataloging every detail of this encounter. She asked calmly what the problem was. The agent demanded identification and proof of citizenship. Not requested, demanded. Now here's where this gets interesting. Judge Richardson could have simply shown her credentials and ended this immediately. She had her federal judge identification in her purse. She had documentation that would have made these agents' faces go pale. But she made a calculated decision in that moment. She refused, because she understood something these agents apparently didn't. American citizens aren't required to carry proof of citizenship. The Fourth Amendment doesn't disappear because someone decides you look foreign. She asked what reasonable suspicion they had for the stop. The agent's response was breathtaking in its inadequacy. He said they'd received reports of suspicious activity in the area, and she matched a description. What description? He couldn't say. Suspicious activity? He wouldn't elaborate. It was the kind of circular reasoning that falls apart under the slightest scrutiny, and Judge Richardson had built a career on scrutinizing exactly this kind of overreach. The interaction escalated quickly. The agent's tone shifted from demanding to aggressive. He told her she was being uncooperative, that her refusal to provide documentation was suspicious in itself, that she needed to step out of the vehicle immediately. Judge Richardson remained seated, hands visible on the steering wheel, voice steady. She explained she was invoking her Fourth Amendment rights against unreasonable search and seizure. She stated clearly she was a federal employee, and this stop was unlawful. That's when the second agent opened her door. What happened next was captured on the parking garage security cameras. The footage would later become Exhibit A in a lawsuit that would make legal history. Judge Richardson was pulled from her vehicle. Her protests were ignored. Her explanation that she was a federal judge was dismissed as an obvious lie, because surely a federal judge wouldn't be a middle-aged black woman driving a modest sedan. Surely a federal judge would be more cooperative. Surely a federal judge would look different. They handcuffed her. Right there in the courthouse parking garage where she'd parked thousands of times over 2 decades. Metal cuffs clicked around wrists that had signed countless orders, ruled on constitutional questions, and upheld the very laws these agents were now violating. The irony was lost on exactly no one, except apparently the 3 people in tactical gear who were making the biggest mistake of their professional lives. Judge Richardson's briefcase was searched without consent. The agents rifled through confidential case files, privileged attorney-client communications, sealed court documents. Every item they touched represented another violation, another federal law broken, another zero added to the eventual settlement. They found her judicial credentials immediately. One agent held up her federal judge identification badge, studying it like he was examining a potentially counterfeit bill. The lead agent's response? He claimed it was probably fake. People impersonate federal officials all the time, he said. They'd need to verify her identity at their field office. Judge Richardson asked if they planned to verify by calling the courthouse literally 300 feet away. The agent ignored the question. She asked if they'd be contacting the chief judge. No response. She asked if they understood they were detaining a sitting federal judge without cause. The agent told her to stop talking. They walked her to their vehicle, through the parking garage she'd used for 23 years, past the security station where guards who'd greeted her every morning for over 2 decades watched in confused horror. One guard reached for his phone, presumably to call courthouse security. An agent told him to stay out of it. This was a federal matter. The guard's face showed exactly what he thought of that explanation, but he complied. The drive to the ice field office took 18 minutes. Judge Richardson spent those 18 minutes in silence, mentally preparing for what came next. She wasn't afraid. Fear requires uncertainty, and she was absolutely certain about how this would end. These agents had just committed career suicide. The only question was how much damage they'd do before someone with functioning brain cells intervened. At the field office, they processed her like any other detainee, photographed, fingerprinted, personal property confiscated and cataloged. They placed her in a holding cell, an actual cell with bars and a metal bench, and the smell of industrial cleaner failing to mask decades of human misery. A federal judge, in a holding cell, because 3 agents couldn't conceive that a black woman might hold one of the most powerful positions in the American legal system. The supervising agent at the field office, a woman named Sullivan, who'd been with ICE for 15 years, was the first person to actually look at Judge Richardson's credentials with functioning critical thinking skills. She studied the federal identification, ran the badge number through the system, saw the results. Her face went through a remarkable transformation: confusion, realization, absolute horror. Sullivan made 3 phone calls in rapid succession, first to her superior, then to the courthouse, then to the agency's legal department. Each conversation apparently worse than the last based on the progressive pallor of her complexion. Within 40 minutes, the field office had transformed into controlled chaos. Senior officials arrived. Lawyers materialized. Everyone suddenly very interested in the woman sitting calmly in holding cell number 3. Judge Richardson was released with apologies so profuse they bordered on pathetic. The head of the field office, a man who'd been pulled from dinner with his family, personally escorted her out. He used words like regrettable and unfortunate and miscommunication. Judge Richardson said nothing. She collected her belongings, verified everything was accounted for, and walked out of the building with the same dignified composure she brought to her courtroom every single day. But this wasn't over. Not even close. Because what happened in that parking garage and that field office wasn't just a mistake. It was a constitutional violation. It was racial profiling. It was false imprisonment. It was an illegal search. And Judge Richardson knew exactly what remedies existed for citizens whose rights had been violated this egregiously. She'd ruled on cases like this dozens of times. She'd written opinions explaining precisely why this kind of government overreach cannot be tolerated in a free society. Now she was about to become the plaintiff in the kind of case she used to decide from the bench. And the federal government was about to learn an expensive lesson about assumptions. The lawsuit was filed 37 days later. Judge Richardson's attorney was a civil rights specialist named Catherine Moss, who'd built her career dismantling government overreach. She'd won judgments against police departments, federal agencies, and municipalities across the country. When Judge Richardson called, Moss cleared her schedule immediately. She knew exactly what this case represented. The complaint was surgical. 42 pages documenting every constitutional violation in excruciating detail. 4th Amendment violations for the unlawful stop and search. 5th Amendment due process violations. 14th Amendment equal protection violations. False imprisonment. Intentional infliction of emotional distress. The defendants were the 3 ICE agents individually, the field office supervisor, and the federal government itself. The damages sought were substantial but not astronomical. $1.7 million, high enough to hurt, low enough to seem reasonable given what happened, But the money was secondary. Judge Richardson wanted something much more valuable than a settlement check. She wanted accountability. Federal lawsuits move slowly under normal circumstances. But this case was different. The moment it hit the docket, people noticed. Legal blogs picked it up within hours. Major news outlets ran stories by that evening. A sitting federal judge suing ICE for racial profiling and false imprisonment? That's not just news. That's a constitutional crisis playing out in real time. The government's initial response was predictable. They moved to dismiss, arguing qualified immunity for the agents. Qualified immunity, that legal doctrine protecting government officials from liability unless they violate clearly established constitutional rights. The same doctrine Judge Richardson had applied countless times from the bench. But here's what makes qualified immunity interesting. It only protects officials when the law isn't clearly established. When their actions fall into some gray area where reasonable people might disagree about constitutionality, detaining someone without probable cause isn't a gray area. Demanding papers from a U.S. citizen based solely on their appearance isn't a gray area. Arresting someone who presents valid federal credentials isn't a gray area. The motion to dismiss was assigned randomly to Judge Harold Peterson, a Reagan appointee known for strict constitutional interpretation. He denied the motion in a 14-page opinion that legal scholars would cite for years. The key passage addressed qualified immunity directly. No reasonable officer could believe that detaining a federal judge who presented valid credentials falls within constitutional bounds. The right to be free from racially motivated seizures was clearly established long before this incident occurred. Translation: the agents were on their own. Discovery began immediately. Moss requested everything: body camera footage from the parking garage, radio communications, training records for all 3 agents, personnel files, internal policies on immigration enforcement, previous complaints against the agents. She wanted to know if this was an isolated incident or part of a pattern. What emerged during discovery was worse than anyone expected. Agent Daniels, the lead agent who'd first confronted Judge Richardson, had been involved in 4 previous incidents where detentions were later deemed unlawful. 4, all involving people of color, all resulting in quiet settlements paid by the government, none resulting in disciplinary action beyond brief suspensions. Agent Lewis had failed bias training twice. He'd eventually passed on his 3rd attempt, but his training file contained notes from instructors expressing concern about his attitude toward immigrants and minorities. Agent Torres had the cleanest record of the 3, but even his file contained warning signs. 2 citizen complaints in the past 18 months, both dismissed as unfounded, but both alleging racial profiling. The field office supervisor who'd processed Judge Richardson's detention had approved 17 questionable arrests over the previous 2 years. 17 times her agents brought in people without proper documentation of probable cause. 17 times she'd signed off anyway. This wasn't 3 bad agents having a bad day. This was systematic failure. Moss deposed each agent separately. The depositions were brutal. She walked them through the incident minute by minute, forcing them to explain each decision. Why didn't you run the federal badge number immediately? Why did you ignore the judicial identification? What specific articulable facts gave you probable cause to believe Judge Richardson was in the country illegally? Their answers fell apart under scrutiny. Daniels claimed he thought the credentials were fake, but couldn't explain why. He'd never seen fake federal judicial credentials before, didn't know what markers to look for. Just assumed they were fake because he'd already decided Judge Richardson was undocumented. Lewis testified that he'd never encountered a black woman who was a federal judge, so the credentials seemed implausible. Moss let that statement hang in the air during the deposition. Just let the court reporter capture it verbatim. That's the kind of testimony that wins cases. Torres was the smartest of the 3. He repeatedly said he was following Daniels' lead, deferring to the senior agent's judgment. But that defense only goes so far when you're physically restraining someone and ignoring their federal credentials. The government's attorneys tried damage control. They offered a settlement 6 months into litigation, $400,000 and an agreement that the agents would receive additional training. Moss rejected it immediately. Judge Richardson wasn't interested in training programs. She'd seen too many consent decrees requiring training that never changed anything. She wanted consequences. The trial date was set for 14 months after the initial incident. As it approached, something unexpected happened. The government replaced their entire legal team. Out went the mid-level attorneys who'd been handling the case. In came senior lawyers from the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, people who normally defended the government in cases involving actual constitutional crises. Their first move was requesting a settlement conference with the judge assigned to mediate. Not Judge Peterson, who denied the motion to dismiss. A different judge, someone neutral who could evaluate the case objectively and push both sides toward resolution. The conference lasted 8 hours. Moss presented her case with the precision of a surgeon. Video evidence, deposition testimony. Expert witnesses prepared to testify about racial profiling and Fourth Amendment violations. Damages, calculations showing economic loss, emotional distress, and punitive damages. The government's new attorneys didn't fight the facts. They couldn't. Instead, they focused on limiting exposure. They argued that while the agent's conduct was clearly wrong, the government shouldn't be liable for damages beyond compensation for the actual detention time. The mediating judge listened to both sides and gave his assessment. The government was going to lose. Badly. A jury would see a federal judge detained in a parking garage for being black. They'd see agents who ignored credentials and training. They'd see a pattern of similar incidents. The verdict could easily exceed $5 million. The settlement offer came 2 days later. $1.4 million. A formal apology from the ICE director. Immediate termination of all 3 agents. Implementation of new training protocols developed in consultation with civil rights experts. Regular auditing of detention practices. And something unusual. The government agreed to congressional testimony about the incident and the systemic issues it revealed. Moss brought the offer to Judge Richardson. They discussed it for 3 hours. The money was close to what they'd requested. The firings were guaranteed. The systemic changes had teeth. The congressional testimony meant public accountability. But was it enough? Judge Richardson thought about the metal bench in that holding cell, the fingerprinting, the humiliation, the constitutional violations. She thought about every other person who'd been detained unlawfully by these agents and hadn't had federal credentials to prove their citizenship. People who'd been deported, families separated, lives destroyed. She accepted the settlement with one addition. Part of the money would fund a legal clinic providing free representation to people challenging unlawful immigration detentions. The government agreed. The settlement was announced on a Tuesday morning. News coverage was immediate and extensive. A federal judge had sued the government for racial profiling and won. 3 agents lost their careers. Policy changes were mandatory. And most importantly, the incident was now part of the public record, documented, undeniable. Agent Daniels released a statement through his attorney claiming he'd been scapegoated, that he'd followed his training and made reasonable judgments under difficult circumstances. The statement landed like a lead balloon. No one bought it, but the consequences weren't finished. Not even close. The settlement wasn't the end. It was barely the beginning. Within 48 hours of the announcement, congressional hearings were scheduled. The House Committee on Homeland Security wanted answers. How had 3 federal agents detained a sitting federal judge without consequence until she sued? What training failures allowed this? How many others had been wrongfully detained? Judge Richardson was called to testify first. She sat at the witness table in her judicial robes. A deliberate choice. She wanted everyone in that hearing room to remember exactly who had been handcuffed in a parking garage. Her testimony was measured, precise, devastating. She walked through every moment. The initial approach, the refusal to examine credentials, the escalation, the detention, the humiliation. But she didn't stop there. She presented research her legal team had compiled. Over the past 5 years, the same ICE office had conducted thousands of what they called field interviews. 87% targeted people of color. 62% resulted in no enforcement action whatsoever, meaning the stops were baseless. Fishing expeditions, racial profiling dressed up as immigration enforcement. Committee members from both parties looked uncomfortable. This wasn't about partisan politics anymore. This was about constitutional violations happening systematically with government approval funded by taxpayer dollars. Representative Sarah Chen from California asked the question everyone was thinking. How many people were deported based on unlawful detentions? How many families were separated? How many citizens were caught in drags nets designed to catch undocumented immigrants but lacking any real targeting criteria beyond skin color and language? Nobody had solid numbers. That was part of the problem. The data wasn't tracked properly. Or perhaps it was tracked and simply never analyzed. Either way, the lack of accountability was staggering. The ICE director testified next. He was defensive from the start. He claimed the agents involved in Judge Richardson's detention were outliers, bad apples, not representative of the agency's culture or training. He insisted that protocols were in place to prevent exactly this kind of incident. Then, Moss stood up. She'd been granted time to question the director directly. She pulled up the training materials the agents had received. Page after page of procedures for verifying identity, examining credentials, and de-escalating encounters. Everything Daniels and his team had ignored. But here's where it got interesting. Moss then presented internal communications she'd obtained through discovery. Emails between supervisors discussing quotas. Not official quotas, because those were illegal, but productivity expectations. Agents were evaluated based on how many people they detained and processed. Quality didn't matter. Numbers did. The director's face went pale. These communications weren't supposed to exist, or at least weren't supposed to become public. They revealed what everyone suspected but couldn't prove. The system incentivized aggressive enforcement without regard for accuracy or rights. One email stood out. A supervisor had written, "Don't waste time on extensive verification in the field. Detain anyone who seems questionable and sort it out at the facility. We need to hit our targets this quarter." That single email demolished the bad apple narrative. This wasn't 3 rogue agents. This was policy. Unwritten, unofficial, deniable policy, but policy nonetheless. Congressional hearings don't typically result in immediate action. They're usually theater. Politicians grandstand, witnesses deflect, nothing changes. But sometimes, rarely, they create enough pressure that change becomes inevitable. This was one of those times. Within 2 weeks, the Department of Homeland Security announced a comprehensive review of ICE detention practices. Independent auditors would examine field operations in every major city. Training would be overhauled. Supervisors who'd sent those quota emails were placed on administrative leave pending investigation. But the ripple effects extended further than government reform. Civil rights organizations that had been fighting these battles for years suddenly had a perfect test case. A federal judge who could articulate exactly what millions of immigrants and people of color experienced but struggled to prove in court. Legal clinics began using Judge Richardson's case as a template. They filed dozens of lawsuits on behalf of people who'd been unlawfully detained, people who didn't have federal credentials or law degrees, people who'd been too afraid or lacked resources to fight back. Maria Santos was one of them. She'd been stopped outside a grocery store 3 years earlier by the same agents who detained Judge Richardson. She was a U.S. citizen, born in Texas, lived there her entire life. But she spoke Spanish to her mother on the phone while loading groceries into her car. That was enough. The agents demanded identification. She showed them her driver's license. They claimed it could be fake and detained her for 6 hours before confirming her citizenship and releasing her without apology. She'd been terrified to complain, afraid of retaliation, afraid nobody would believe her. Now, with Judge Richardson's case as precedent, Maria had attorneys lining up to represent her. Her lawsuit was filed 4 months after the settlement. It included similar claims: racial profiling, unlawful detention, constitutional violations, and it cited Judge Richardson's case extensively. The government tried to distinguish the cases, Maria wasn't a federal judge. She didn't have the same credentials, but the core facts were identical. Citizens detained based solely on appearance and language. Rights violated. No probable cause. Maria's case settled within 8 months. The amount wasn't disclosed, but sources close to the negotiations said it was substantial. More importantly, it established that you didn't need to be a judge to have rights. Citizenship alone was enough. 17 more cases followed, each one adding pressure, each one costing taxpayers money, each one revealing the scope of the problem. But not everyone saw this as progress. Agent Daniels certainly didn't. After being fired, he'd struggled to find work. His law enforcement career was finished. Nobody would hire someone terminated for detaining a federal judge. He'd applied to private security firms, corporate investigation companies, even retail loss prevention. Everyone passed. He blamed Judge Richardson. In his mind, she'd overreacted, made a federal case, literally, out of a simple misunderstanding. He'd been doing his job, following orders, meeting expectations, and now his life was ruined. Daniels started giving interviews. Conservative media outlets loved his story. Government overreach, political correctness run amok, an agent destroyed for trying to enforce immigration law. The narrative ignored every actual fact of the case, but it played well to certain audiences. He appeared on podcasts claiming he'd been targeted for being effective, that Judge Richardson had pulled strings to destroy him, that the settlement was hush money to cover up her own suspicious behavior. None of it was true. All of it got traction. Judge Richardson didn't respond publicly. She didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves. The video evidence, the court filings, the settlement terms. Everything was public record. People who wanted truth could find it. But Daniels' media tour did accomplish something unintended. It kept the story alive. Every interview reminded people what had happened. Every podcast appearance generated new articles. Every social media post brought more attention to systemic problems in immigration enforcement. Organizations fighting for immigrant rights used Daniels as a perfect example of why reform was necessary. Here was an agent who still, after everything, couldn't acknowledge wrongdoing, who saw no problem with his actions, who blamed his victim for consequences he'd brought on himself. Meanwhile, the other 2 agents involved stayed silent. They'd also been fired, also struggled to find work. But they'd made different calculations. Fighting publicly would only make things worse. Better to fade into obscurity and hope people forgot. The legal clinic funded by Judge Richardson's settlement opened 6 months after the announcement. It was staffed by experienced immigration attorneys and law students from nearby universities. The demand was immediate and overwhelming. Hundreds of people came forward with stories of unlawful detentions, traffic stops that turned into immigration interrogations, workplace raids where citizens were detained alongside undocumented workers, home visits where agents demanded papers without warrants. Not every case was viable. Some lacked evidence. Others fell outside statutes of limitations, but enough were solid that the clinic filed a new lawsuit almost weekly. Each one chipped away at the system that enabled these violations. The financial impact on the government was substantial. Settlements were adding up. Legal defense costs were mounting. Insurance premiums for law enforcement agencies were increasing. Suddenly, unlawful detentions weren't just constitutional violations, they were budget problems. And budget problems get attention in ways moral arguments sometimes don't. Agencies started changing policies not because it was right, but because it was expensive. Training programs were revised, oversight mechanisms strengthened, complaint procedures streamlined. Progress driven by financial pain rather than moral awakening, but progress nonetheless. Judge Richardson watched these developments from her chambers. She'd returned to her normal caseload, hearing disputes and making rulings like any other day, but she received regular updates from the clinic. Reports on cases filed, outcomes achieved, lives affected. The numbers told a story of systemic change beginning to take root. 2 years after her detention, she was invited to speak at a law school symposium on civil rights enforcement. She rarely accepted such invitations, preferring to let her work speak for itself. But this felt important. The audience was full of future lawyers, future judges, future advocates, people who could carry this work forward. Her speech was characteristically direct. She didn't dwell on her personal experience. Instead, she focused on what it revealed about broader patterns, how power operates unchecked without accountability, how rights mean nothing if people don't know how to assert them, how systems protect themselves unless forced to change. She talked about the importance of documentation, recording interactions, collecting evidence, building cases that couldn't be dismissed or ignored. She emphasized that individual victories meant little without structural reform, that settling one case while leaving broken systems intact was just putting bandages on bullet wounds. The speech resonated. Students approached her afterward with questions. Some shared their own experiences with unlawful stops and searches. Others asked how they could get involved with similar work. Several mentioned they were reconsidering their career plans, thinking about public interest law instead of corporate positions. One student, a young woman whose parents had immigrated from Guatemala, thanked Judge Richardson for fighting back. She said her father had been detained 3 years earlier at a traffic stop, held for 6 hours despite being a citizen. He'd been too afraid to complain, worried it would bring more trouble. But seeing what Judge Richardson accomplished made him reconsider. He'd filed a complaint last month. An investigation was underway. These ripple effects were impossible to quantify but undeniably real. Each person who stood up made it slightly easier for the next person. Each successful case established precedent for future ones. Each policy change created new protections. Slow, incremental, frustrating progress. But progress. The federal government eventually issued new guidelines for immigration enforcement. They required specific, articulable facts before detaining anyone for immigration status checks, prohibited prolonged detention without cause, mandated better training on constitutional rights, established clearer complaint procedures. Were the guidelines perfect? No. Were they always followed? Absolutely not. But they existed now. Organizations could point to official policy when challenging violations. Lawyers had concrete standards to reference in lawsuits. Judges had frameworks for evaluating whether agents acted appropriately. Daniel's media appearances gradually decreased. The story got old. Audiences moved on to newer outrages. He eventually stopped giving interviews and took a job doing background checks for a small company in another state. He never publicly acknowledged wrongdoing, never expressed regret for what he'd put Judge Richardson through. As far as anyone knows, he still believes he was right. The other 2 agents faded even further from public view. One left law enforcement entirely, last known to be working in construction. The other moved overseas, reportedly doing security work for a private contractor. Neither ever spoke publicly about the incident. 3 years after the detention, the legal clinic had handled over 400 cases. 68 resulted in settlements. 42 led to policy changes at various agencies. 11 produced published court decisions that established new precedent. Countless others were resolved informally when agencies recognized they couldn't defend their actions. The financial toll on government agencies exceeded $12 million. Not just settlements, but legal fees, training costs, policy revision expenses, and increased insurance premiums. Agencies that once treated unlawful detentions as minor issues now had entire departments devoted to preventing them. Judge Richardson continued serving on the bench. Her rulings remained sharp and well-reasoned, her courtroom efficient and fair. She never sought publicity for what happened, never wrote a book or gave paid speeches. The work itself was enough, but she'd changed in subtle ways. Colleagues noticed she was more patient with self-represented litigants who didn't understand courtroom procedures, more willing to explain legal concepts in plain language, more attuned to power imbalances between parties. The experience of being powerless, even briefly, had deepened her empathy for others in similar positions. 5 years after the incident, Congress held hearings on immigration enforcement practices. Judge Richardson was invited to testify. She considered declining. Testifying meant reliving the experience publicly, meant becoming the face of an issue rather than just another person affected by it, meant dealing with hostile questions from representatives who'd rather defend agents than protect rights. She testified anyway. Her statement was measured and factual. She described what happened without dramatization, presented evidence of systemic problems without partisan rhetoric, proposed specific reforms based on demonstrated needs. She didn't ask for sympathy, didn't position herself as a victim, just explained what went wrong and how to prevent it from happening again. Some representatives thanked her for her service and courage. Others suggested she was exaggerating. One implied she'd somehow provoked the detention through her behavior. She responded calmly to each question, never losing composure, always bringing the discussion back to facts and evidence. Nothing immediately changed after the hearings. Congress didn't pass sweeping reform legislation. No dramatic policy shifts emerged. But the testimony entered the official record. It could be cited in future cases, referenced in policy debates, used by advocates pushing for change. That's how progress actually works most of the time. Not through single dramatic moments, but through accumulated pressure over years. Each lawsuit adding weight, each settlement creating precedent, each policy change establishing new baselines. Slow, grinding, unglamorous work that eventually shifts what's considered acceptable. The legal clinic continues operating. It's handled over 1,000 cases now, secured millions in settlements, changed policies at dozens of agencies, trained hundreds of law students who've gone on to do similar work elsewhere. The ripple effects keep expanding. Unlawful immigration detentions still happen. The problem isn't solved, but it's better than it was. Agents face real consequences now. Victims have clearer paths to justice. Systems have more accountability built in. Not perfect, but improved. Judge Richardson's detention lasted 4 hours. The consequences have lasted years and will continue long after she retires. That's the real measure of what happened that day. Not just one person's experience, but how that experience catalyzed change, affecting thousands of others. She could have accepted the apology and moved on. Could have stayed quiet to avoid controversy. Could have prioritized her comfort over broader impact. She chose differently. Chose to fight back. Chose to demand accountability. Chose to turn personal violation into systematic reform. That choice mattered. Not because it made her special or heroic, but because it demonstrated what's possible when people refuse to accept injustice as inevitable. When they document what happens, build strong cases, push for real consequences, follow through even when it's difficult and uncomfortable. The system doesn't fix itself. It changes because people force it to change. Through lawsuits and complaints and testimony and persistent pressure. Through refusing to let violations slide. Through turning individual incidents into broader fights for accountability. 4 hours in a detention room. Years of impact rippling outward. That's the real story here. Not what happened to one judge one afternoon, but what that judge made happen afterward. The parking garage where it started looks the same as it always did. Cars come and go. People walk to their vehicles after work. Security guards wave at familiar faces. Nothing marks the spot where 3 federal agents made a decision that would cost millions and reshape policy across the country. Judge Richardson still parks there sometimes when she has cases at that courthouse. She's never spoken publicly about whether she thinks about that afternoon when she pulls into her usual spot, whether she glances at the place where agents surrounded her car, whether she feels anything particular when she walks past the security station where guards watched helplessly. What we do know is this: the $8.3 million figure that eventually emerged wasn't just her settlement. It was the cumulative cost across all related cases, policy changes, training programs, and legal fees that followed. Her initial settlement of $1.4 million was just the beginning. The real price tag came from everything her case set in motion. Other agencies learned from what happened. They revised their procedures not out of moral epiphany, but because the alternative was too expensive. Police departments updated their training materials. Border Patrol modified their protocols. Local law enforcement agencies added new sections to their policy manuals about verifying credentials and respecting constitutional rights. The 3 agents never worked in law enforcement again. Their names became cautionary tales in training academies, examples of what not to do. How assumptions and bias can destroy careers and cost taxpayers millions. Whether they learned anything personally remains unclear. Only one ever spoke publicly, and his comments suggested he still saw himself as a victim rather than someone who'd violated fundamental rights. But the broader impact kept spreading. Law students study the case in constitutional law classes. Civil rights attorneys cite it in briefs. Advocacy organizations reference it when pushing for reform. It became part of the legal landscape, a data point in ongoing fights over immigration enforcement, racial profiling, and government accountability. The clinic, Judge Richardson funded with settlement money, has outlasted initial expectations. It was supposed to operate for 3 years. It's been 7 now, sustained by additional grants and donations. The cases keep coming. People who experienced similar violations but lacked resources to fight back. The clinic gives them what Judge Richardson had: skilled attorneys, documented evidence, and the determination to see cases through. Not every case succeeds. Some lack sufficient evidence. Others run into procedural barriers. A few get dismissed on technicalities. But enough win that the work continues. Each victory makes the next one slightly easier. Each settlement establishes precedent. Each policy change creates new standards. The system still isn't fixed. Unlawful detentions still happen. Racial profiling persists. Power still gets abused. But there's more accountability now than before. More oversight. More consequences. More people willing to fight back because they've seen it's possible to win. That's what Judge Richardson's case ultimately demonstrated. Not that justice is guaranteed, or that one lawsuit can fix systemic problems, but that fighting back matters. That documentation and persistence can overcome institutional resistance. That sometimes the system does respond when forced to confront its failures. She went back to work the day after her release from detention, heard cases, made rulings, performed the job she'd been doing for over 2 decades. She didn't let what happened define her or derail her career. She simply refused to accept it as normal or inevitable. 4 hours changed years of policy. One person's refusal to stay silent created space for hundreds of others to speak up. A single case sparked reforms that affected thousands. Not because Judge Richardson was special, but because she understood something fundamental about how change actually happens. It happens when people refuse to accept violations as the cost of existing in their own country, when they demand accountability instead of apologies, when they transform personal experience into systematic pressure. When they do, the unglamorous work of documentation and litigation and testimony, the parking garage looks the same. But the world around it shifted slightly. Not enough, never enough, but more than before. And that difference, small as it might seem, represents real lives affected, real rights protected, real accountability enforced. That's the measure of what happened when 3 agents made assumptions based on skin color and a federal judge decided those assumptions would cost them everything. This case was brutal, but the case on the right spirals completely out of control.
Ma'am, give me your ID right now.
Sir, what seems to be the problem?
You're acting suspicious. ID now.
I'm just getting gas. I can comply if you...
Stop talking and do what I told you.
My children are here. Please step back.
Hands where I can see them.
The dashboard camera footage revealed everything in crystal clear detail. At 3:17 p.m. on a scorching Tuesday afternoon, a black Mercedes sedan pulled into pump number 4 at the East Side Shell station. Behind the wheel sat a distinguished woman in her early 50s, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, wearing the kind of professional attire that spoke of courtrooms and legal briefs. In the back seat, 2 children aged 8 and 12 were absorbed in their tablets, completely unaware that their ordinary day was about to become a nightmare that would forever change their family's life. What happened next would shock the nation, spark federal investigations, and result in one of the largest police brutality settlements in state history. But more than that, it would expose a culture of corruption and racial bias so deep that it would take years to fully unravel. The woman stepping out of that Mercedes had no idea she was about to become the center of a legal storm that would reshape how we think about police accountability. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. And if this is your first time here, make sure to hit that subscribe button because stories like this one need to be told, and you won't want to miss how this unfolds. Trust me, what you're about to hear will leave you speechless. Judge Rebecca Coleman had just finished a particularly challenging day in family court. She had presided over 3 custody hearings, 2 adoption proceedings, and 1 case involving child endangerment that had kept her up the night before. As one of only 7 black female judges in the entire state, she carried the weight of representation on her shoulders every single day. She knew that her decisions, her demeanor, and even her appearance were scrutinized more closely than her white male counterparts. That afternoon, she had picked up her daughter Maya and son Joshua from their summer camp program. Maya was 8 years old, a bright kid who wanted to be a veterinarian when she grew up. Joshua, 12, was obsessed with basketball and had been begging his mom to let him try out for the travel team. They were typical kids with typical dreams, and Rebecca worked hard to give them a normal childhood despite the demands of her position. The gas station stop was routine. Rebecca's Mercedes was running low on fuel, and she wanted to fill up before the evening rush hour traffic made the drive home even longer. She pulled up to the pump, turned off the engine, and told the kids she'd be right back. Maya barely looked up from her tablet, where she was watching videos about baby animals. Joshua was deep in a basketball game on his phone. Rebecca stepped out of her car, inserted her credit card into the pump, and began the familiar process of filling her tank. The gas station was moderately busy, with the usual mix of commuters heading home from work. Nothing seemed unusual. The sun was bright, the temperature was climbing toward 90 degrees, and Rebecca was already thinking about what to make for dinner. That's when Officer Kevin Nash spotted her from his patrol car parked across the street. Nash was a 15-year veteran of the Metro Police Department, with a history that would later become the subject of intense scrutiny. He had joined the force straight out of high school, working his way up from beat cop to patrol supervisor. On paper, his record looked decent enough. He had received commendations for community service and had never been formally disciplined for excessive force. But scratch beneath the surface, and a different picture emerged. Internal complaints had been filed against Nash 7 times in the past 3 years. All 7 complaints came from black citizens who claimed he had treated them with unnecessary aggression or had stopped them without probable cause. Each complaint had been investigated by his own department and dismissed due to lack of evidence or conflicting witness statements. Nash's fellow officers consistently backed up his version of events, and the complainants were often portrayed as unreliable or having ulterior motives. What the department didn't know was that Nash had been posting on social media forums under an anonymous username for years. He shared his views about certain neighborhoods, certain types of people, and what he saw as the real problems facing law enforcement. These posts would later be discovered by federal investigators and would paint a picture of an officer whose personal beliefs had no business being anywhere near a badge and gun. That Tuesday afternoon, Nash claimed later in his incident report that he noticed a black Mercedes at the gas station and thought the vehicle looked suspicious. He said something about the way the driver was acting seemed off, though he could never articulate exactly what that meant. He decided to conduct what he called a welfare check. Nash pulled his cruiser into the gas station parking lot and approached Rebecca while she was still pumping gas. The children were still in the back seat, visible through the rear windows, still absorbed in their devices. Rebecca noticed the police car pull up but didn't think much of it. Officers sometimes stopped at gas stations for coffee or snacks. She continued pumping her gas. Nash got out of his patrol car and walked directly toward Rebecca. His body language was already aggressive, his shoulders squared, his hand resting on his duty belt. Rebecca looked up as he approached, offering the polite smile she had learned to give to law enforcement officers, the kind of smile that said she was cooperative and non-threatening. Nash didn't return the smile. Instead, he demanded to see her identification. Rebecca, confused, asked if there was a problem. Nash repeated his demand, louder this time, drawing the attention of other customers at nearby pumps. Rebecca remained calm and asked again what the issue was. She explained that she was simply getting gas and would be leaving shortly. This is when Nash made his first major mistake. He told Rebecca that she was acting suspicious and that he had received reports of someone matching her description involved in suspicious activity in the area. This was a complete lie, and the gas station's security cameras would later prove that Nash had no radio communication about any suspicious activity. He had fabricated the entire justification for the stop. Rebecca, drawing on her years of legal experience, asked Nash to be specific about what activity she was suspected of. She spoke calmly and clearly, using the kind of measured tone she employed in her courtroom. She knew her rights, and she knew that Nash's behavior was already crossing legal lines. But she also knew that challenging a police officer, especially as a black woman, could escalate a situation quickly and dangerously. Nash didn't like being questioned. He stepped closer to Rebecca, invading her personal space. He told her to stop asking questions and produce her identification immediately. Rebecca, still trying to de-escalate, reached for her purse to retrieve her driver's license. As she did, Nash apparently decided that her movement toward her purse was threatening. What happened next was captured on multiple security cameras from different angles. Nash grabbed Rebecca's wrist and twisted it behind her back before she could even open her purse. She cried out in pain and told him he was hurting her. Nash ignored her and forced her to bend over the hood of her car. The gas pump handle was still in the tank, gas still flowing. Other customers at the gas station stopped what they were doing and began to stare. Some pulled out their phones and started recording. A few people called out, asking if everything was okay. Nash yelled for everyone to mind their own business and step back. Inside the Mercedes, Maya and Joshua heard their mother's voice. They looked up from their devices to see a police officer forcing their mother over the hood of their car. Maya started crying immediately. Joshua, older and more aware of what was happening, began recording on his phone while shouting for the officer to stop hurting his mom. Rebecca tried to explain to Nash that she was a judge, that there had been a misunderstanding, and that she would gladly show him her identification if he would just let her reach for it safely. Nash either didn't hear her or didn't care. He was committed to his course of action now, and backing down would mean admitting he had made a mistake. Nash called for backup, claiming over his radio that he had a combative suspect who was resisting arrest. This was another lie that would later be contradicted by the video evidence. Rebecca was not combative, and she was certainly not resisting arrest, since Nash had never actually announced that she was under arrest for anything. Within minutes, 2 additional patrol cars arrived at the scene. Officers Williams and Rodriguez stepped out of their vehicles and immediately assessed the situation. What they saw should have been a red flag. A well-dressed professional woman bent over a car hood while Nash held her in place, 2 children crying in the back seat, and a crowd of witnesses recording everything on their phones. Instead of questioning Nash's actions or attempting to de-escalate, both officers assumed that Nash must have had good reason for the detention. This assumption would prove to be another critical failure in the chain of events that was spiraling out of control. Nash decided he needed to search Rebecca's purse for weapons or evidence of whatever crime he was convinced she had committed. When he reached for her purse, Rebecca instinctively pulled it closer to her body. This natural protective response was interpreted by Nash as continued resistance. Have you ever witnessed something like this happening in public? Let me know in the comments if you've seen police interactions that made you uncomfortable. Nash made the decision to physically remove the purse from Rebecca's possession. As he grabbed for it, Rebecca stumbled slightly, trying to maintain her balance while still bent over the car hood. Nash interpreted this as an attempt to flee or fight back. What happened next would become the focal point of the federal civil rights lawsuit that followed. Nash, claiming that Rebecca was actively resisting and potentially dangerous, made the split-second decision to take her to the ground. But this wasn't a controlled takedown or a textbook arrest procedure. This was a violent tackle that sent both of them crashing into the pavement next to the gas pump. Rebecca's head hit the concrete with a sickening thud that was audible on the security camera footage. Her professional blazer tore as she scraped across the rough asphalt. Nash's full body weight came down on top of her, driving her face first into the ground. The impact was so severe that witnesses later said they thought they had just watched someone die. Maya's screaming intensified as she watched her mother disappear beneath the police officer. Joshua jumped out of the car, still recording, screaming at Nash to get off his mom. Officer Rodriguez had to physically restrain the 12-year-old boy to prevent him from interfering with what Nash was still claiming was a lawful arrest. Rebecca lay motionless for several seconds, blood beginning to pool beneath her head where it had struck the concrete. Nash, realizing that the situation had escalated far beyond what he had intended, finally got off of her and called for an ambulance. But the damage was done, and not just the physical damage to Rebecca's body. The crowd of witnesses had grown larger, and multiple people were now recording from different angles. The gas station's security system had captured everything in high definition. A sitting judge had just been brutally tackled by a police officer in front of her children for the crime of getting gas while black. Rebecca remained unconscious for nearly 3 minutes while paramedics were en route. During those terrifying moments, Nash stood over her motionless body, apparently trying to process what he had just done. Officer Williams knelt beside Rebecca, checking for a pulse while repeatedly asking if she could hear him. The children's cries echoed across the gas station parking lot, creating a scene that would haunt everyone who witnessed it. When Rebecca finally regained consciousness, she was disoriented and bleeding from a deep gash on her forehead. Her vision was blurry, and she couldn't remember where she was or what had happened. The first thing she saw was Nash's face hovering above her, and she instinctively tried to move away from him, which Nash again interpreted as resistance. The ambulance arrived 7 minutes after Nash's call for medical assistance. Paramedic Sarah Johnson later testified that she had never seen such obvious head trauma from what was supposed to be a routine police detention. Rebecca's pupils were dilated, she was showing signs of severe concussion, and she had sustained multiple lacerations from the concrete impact. But Nash wasn't finished. Even as paramedics were trying to assess Rebecca's injuries, he insisted on handcuffing her to the ambulance gurney. When Rebecca asked why she was being arrested, Nash told her she was being charged with resisting arrest, assaulting an officer, and disorderly conduct. None of these charges had any basis in reality, but Nash needed to justify his actions somehow. The ride to Metro General Hospital became another chapter in this growing nightmare. Rebecca drifted in and out of consciousness while handcuffed to a medical stretcher. Maya and Joshua were not allowed to ride in the ambulance with their mother. Instead, they were left at the gas station with Officer Rodriguez, 2 traumatized children who had just watched their mother get brutally attacked by someone who was supposed to protect and serve. What do you think should have happened to Nash immediately after this incident? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. At the hospital, Rebecca was taken directly to the emergency room where Dr. Amanda Foster began evaluating her injuries. The head trauma was severe enough to require a CT scan to rule out brain bleeding. She had sustained a concussion, multiple facial lacerations, severe bruising on her back and shoulders, and a sprained wrist from when Nash had twisted her arm behind her back. Dr. Foster was appalled when she learned that her patient was handcuffed to the hospital bed. She demanded that Nash remove the restraints, pointing out that Rebecca was clearly in no condition to pose a threat to anyone. Nash refused, claiming that Rebecca was a dangerous criminal who might try to escape. The absurdity of this statement became even more apparent when Dr. Foster learned that Rebecca was a sitting judge. Nash had no idea who he had just brutalized. In his incident report, he described Rebecca as an uncooperative suspect who had matched the description of someone involved in suspicious activity. He claimed she had resisted his lawful commands and had attempted to assault him during the arrest. Every single word was a fabrication, but Nash was counting on the usual blue wall of silence to protect him. The truth began to emerge when Rebecca's husband, Dr. Michael Coleman, arrived at the hospital after receiving a frantic call from Joshua. Michael was a respected cardiologist at the same hospital where his wife was now being treated. When he saw Rebecca handcuffed to a bed with her face covered in bandages, he immediately understood that something catastrophic had occurred. Michael demanded answers from Nash, who was still stationed outside Rebecca's hospital room. Nash gave him the same story about suspicious activity and resisting arrest. Michael, who had been married to Rebecca for 16 years, knew that his wife would never resist a police officer. She was too smart, too experienced with the legal system, and too aware of the dangers that confrontation could bring. That's when Michael revealed what Nash had been trying to avoid facing all afternoon. He told Nash that his wife was Judge Rebecca Coleman of the 5th District Court, a woman who had spent her entire career working within the justice system that Nash claimed to represent. The color drained from Nash's face as the implications of what he had done began to sink in. Within an hour, news of the incident had reached the courthouse where Rebecca worked. Judge Harold Patterson, the chief judge of the district, immediately contacted the mayor's office and the police commissioner. Word spread quickly through the legal community that one of their own had been brutally assaulted by a police officer while simply getting gas with her children. The police department's initial response was predictable and infuriating. Commissioner Robert Hayes held a press conference that evening where he promised a thorough investigation while also cautioning the public not to rush to judgment. He emphasized that police officers make split-second decisions in dangerous situations and that all the facts needed to be gathered before drawing conclusions. This measured response might have worked if the incident had been captured by a single, grainy security camera from a distance. But the gas station's high-definition surveillance system had recorded everything from multiple angles. Additionally, at least 12 witnesses had recorded portions of the encounter on their phones. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. The video footage began circulating on social media that same evening. The first clip, posted by Joshua himself, showed Nash tackling his mother to the ground while Maya screamed in the background. The 19-second video was viewed over 2 million times in the first 6 hours after it was posted. The hashtag Justice for Judge Coleman began trending nationally before midnight. Legal experts who reviewed the footage were unanimous in their assessment. Rebecca had done nothing that could remotely justify Nash's actions. She had been polite, cooperative, and had attempted to comply with his requests. Nash had escalated the situation at every turn, lied about his justifications, and used excessive force against a woman who posed no threat whatsoever. The children's trauma became another devastating element of the story. Maya, who was only 8 years old, had nightmares every night for weeks after the incident. She would wake up screaming, convinced that police officers were coming to hurt her mother again. Joshua, who had tried to be brave and document what was happening, blamed himself for not doing more to protect Rebecca. Child psychologist Dr. Lisa Chen, who would later treat both children, explained that witnessing a parent being violently attacked by an authority figure creates deep psychological wounds that can last a lifetime. The children had learned in the most traumatic way possible that the world was not safe, that people in positions of power could hurt their family without consequences. Rebecca spent 3 days in the hospital recovering from her injuries. The physical wounds would heal, but the psychological trauma ran much deeper. She had dedicated her life to believing in the justice system, to the idea that law and order existed to protect innocent people. In one afternoon, a rogue police officer had shattered that fundamental belief. The legal response began immediately. Rebecca's brother, attorney David Coleman, flew in from Washington, D.C., where he worked as a federal prosecutor. He brought with him a team of civil rights lawyers who specialized in police misconduct cases. They began gathering evidence, interviewing witnesses, and preparing what would become one of the most significant police brutality lawsuits in the state's history. Nash, meanwhile, was placed on administrative leave pending the department's internal investigation. He hired attorney Frank Morrison, a lawyer who specialized in defending police officers accused of excessive force. Morrison's strategy was predictable. He would argue that Nash had acted within his training and that the incident had been blown out of proportion by anti-police sentiment. The first major break in the case came when federal investigators obtained Nash's complete personnel file and began digging into his background. What they discovered was a pattern of behavior that the local police department had either ignored or actively covered up. The 7 previous complaints against Nash were just the tip of the iceberg. Investigators found that Nash had been involved in 17 use-of-force incidents in his 15-year career, a rate that was nearly 4 times higher than the department average. In each case, Nash had claimed that the suspect was resisting or posed a threat. In each case, the suspects were black or Hispanic. In each case, Nash's version of events had been accepted without serious scrutiny. The federal investigation also uncovered Nash's social media activity. Under the username Patriot Officer 1987, Nash had posted hundreds of messages on law enforcement forums expressing his views about crime, race, and policing. The posts revealed a man who saw certain communities as inherently criminal and who believed that aggressive policing was the only way to maintain order. One particularly damning post, written just 2 months before the incident with Rebecca, read, "These people think they can drive around in fancy cars and act like they're better than everyone else. They need to be reminded that the law applies to them too, no matter how much money they have or what kind of job they think makes them special." The discovery of these posts transformed the case from a simple, excessive force incident into a federal civil rights violation with clear evidence of racial motivation. Nash had targeted Rebecca not because of any suspicious behavior, but because he couldn't tolerate seeing a successful black woman in an expensive car. Public pressure mounted as more details emerged. Protests began forming outside the police station and the courthouse. Community leaders demanded Nash's immediate termination and criminal prosecution. The state attorney general announced that her office would conduct its own investigation parallel to the federal inquiry. Rebecca, still recovering from her physical injuries, made the difficult decision to speak publicly about what had happened to her. At a press conference held 1 week after the incident, she sat beside her husband and children, her face still showing the bruises from Nash's attack. Her statement was measured and powerful. She spoke about the fear she had felt lying unconscious on the concrete, not knowing if she would survive to see her children grow up. She talked about the trauma her kids had experienced and the long road to recovery that lay ahead for their entire family. But she also spoke about justice and accountability. Rebecca made it clear that she wasn't seeking revenge against Nash or the police department. She wanted systemic change that would prevent other families from experiencing the same trauma. She wanted training programs, oversight mechanisms, and cultural shifts that would root out the kind of thinking that had led to her assault. The legal proceedings moved forward on multiple fronts. The federal civil rights investigation continued gathering evidence. The state was preparing criminal charges against Nash, and Rebecca's civil lawsuit was building toward what would become a historic settlement. Nash's defense began crumbling as more evidence emerged. Security footage from other businesses in the area showed Nash's patrol car following Rebecca's Mercedes for several blocks before the gas station stop, contradicting his claim that the encounter was random. Cell phone records proved that Nash had not received any radio calls about suspicious activity in the area. Most damaging of all was the testimony of Officer Williams, Nash's backup, who had arrived at the scene. Under pressure from federal investigators and facing potential charges himself for failing to intervene, Williams admitted that Nash's actions had seemed excessive from the moment he arrived at the gas station. Williams testified that Nash had already escalated the situation beyond what any reasonable officer would consider appropriate. He said that Rebecca had appeared calm and cooperative, and that Nash's decision to tackle her seemed to come from nowhere. Williams admitted that he should have stepped in to stop Nash, but had been afraid to challenge a senior officer. This testimony was crucial because it came from within the police department itself. It demonstrated that even Nash's fellow officers recognized that his behavior was outside the bounds of acceptable police conduct. The criminal case against Nash moved through the system with unprecedented speed. District Attorney Maria Santos, who had worked closely with Rebecca on several high-profile cases over the years, personally took charge of the prosecution. Santos had never seen such clear-cut evidence of police misconduct in her 23 years as a prosecutor. The grand jury took less than 2 hours to return indictments against Nash on multiple charges, including aggravated assault, deprivation of civil rights under color of law, filing false police reports, and official misconduct. Each charge carried significant prison time, and the federal hate crime enhancements meant Nash was looking at potentially decades behind bars. Nash's attorney tried desperately to negotiate a plea deal, but Santos wasn't interested in bargaining. The evidence was too strong, the misconduct too egregious, and the public interest too great. This case would go to trial, and Nash would face the full consequences of his actions. The trial began 6 months after the gas station incident. The courthouse was packed every day with supporters of the Coleman family, civil rights activists, and members of the legal community who wanted to see justice served. Security was tight as emotions ran high on both sides. Rebecca testified on the second day of the trial. She described in vivid detail the confusion and terror she felt as Nash escalated what should have been a simple interaction. She talked about the moment she realized her children were watching their mother being brutally attacked by someone they had been taught to trust and respect. The most powerful moment came when Rebecca described regaining consciousness on the concrete. She said the first thing she thought about wasn't her own injuries, but whether Maya and Joshua would ever feel safe again. The courtroom was completely silent as she spoke, and several jurors were visibly moved by her testimony. The defense tried to portray Nash as a dedicated officer who had made an honest mistake under pressure. They brought in character witnesses and attempted to argue that Nash had genuinely believed Rebecca posed a threat, but the video evidence made their arguments seem ridiculous. No reasonable person watching the footage could conclude that Rebecca had done anything threatening or suspicious. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They played the security camera footage from multiple angles, showing clearly that Rebecca had been cooperative throughout the encounter. They presented Nash's social media posts, revealing his pattern of racial bias. They called expert witnesses who explained how Nash's actions violated every standard of professional police conduct. Dr. Patricia Hernandez, a use of force expert and former police captain, testified that Nash's decision to tackle Rebecca was not only unnecessary but criminally reckless. She explained that taking someone to the ground on concrete carries a high risk of serious injury or death, and that such force should only be used when facing an immediate threat to life or safety. The jury also heard from the gas station witnesses who had recorded the incident on their phones. One after another, they testified that Rebecca had appeared calm and confused, not aggressive or threatening. A retired teacher named Robert Jenkins said watching Nash attack Rebecca was one of the most disturbing things he had ever witnessed. Perhaps the most damaging testimony came from Nash's own training instructors at the police academy. Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez, who had taught de-escalation techniques for 15 years, reviewed the footage and testified that Nash had violated virtually every principle she had taught him about managing civilian encounters. Nash took the stand in his own defense, a decision that proved disastrous. Under cross-examination, he couldn't explain why he had lied in his incident report about receiving calls about suspicious activity. He couldn't justify why he had escalated the encounter instead of simply asking to see Rebecca's identification. And he couldn't provide any reasonable explanation for why tackling an unarmed woman to concrete pavement had been necessary. The prosecutor pressed Nash about his social media posts, forcing him to read some of his most inflammatory comments aloud in court. When asked if he believed his attitudes about race had influenced his treatment of Rebecca, Nash claimed they hadn't, but his defensive responses suggested otherwise. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Nash showed no emotion as the verdicts were read, but his family members in the courtroom broke down in tears. Rebecca, sitting in the front row with her husband and children, felt a mixture of relief and sadness as justice was finally served. The sentencing hearing took place 2 months later. Judge Thomas Anderson, who had presided over the trial, made it clear that he viewed Nash's crimes as particularly heinous because they had been committed under color of law. Anderson noted that police officers take an oath to protect and serve, and Nash had violated that sacred trust in the most brutal way possible. Nash received 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. He was also ordered to pay restitution to the Coleman family for their medical expenses and counseling costs. Most importantly, Nash was permanently banned from working in law enforcement anywhere in the United States. The civil lawsuit against the police department moved forward simultaneously with the criminal case. Rebecca's legal team had assembled a mountain of evidence showing that Nash's behavior was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader pattern of racial bias and excessive force that the department had failed to address. Internal documents revealed that the police department had received dozens of complaints about racially motivated stops and searches over the past 5 years. Nearly all of these complaints had been dismissed without serious investigation. The department's own data showed that black motorists were stopped at rates far higher than their representation in the population, yet contraband was found at lower rates than with white drivers. The federal investigation had also uncovered evidence of a toxic culture within certain units of the police department. Officers routinely made racist jokes and comments, and those who spoke out against such behavior faced retaliation and ostracism. Nash had thrived in this environment, emboldened by supervisors who looked the other way and colleagues who shared his biases. Commissioner Hayes, who had initially defended Nash's actions, was forced to resign in disgrace when internal emails revealed that he had been aware of multiple complaints against Nash but had taken no meaningful action. The emails showed Hayes dismissing the complaints as politically motivated attacks on law enforcement. The city brought in a new police commissioner, Angela Foster, a reform-minded leader from another state who had a track record of cleaning up troubled departments. Foster immediately implemented new training programs, revised use of force policies, and established an independent oversight board with civilian members. But the damage to the department's reputation was severe and lasting. Community trust, built up over decades, had been shattered in a single afternoon at a gas station. Foster faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding relationships with communities that now viewed police with suspicion and fear. The settlement negotiations were intense and prolonged. The city's insurance company initially offered $2 million, an amount that Rebecca's attorneys immediately rejected as insulting. They pointed to recent settlements in similar cases and argued that the Coleman family deserved much more, both for the severity of the assault and the clear evidence of institutional failure. As the negotiations dragged on, more evidence emerged about the department's systemic problems. A whistleblower came forward with documents showing that Nash's supervisors had altered previous incident reports to make his actions appear more justified. This discovery added another layer of misconduct to an already damning case. The breakthrough came when federal mediators became involved in the settlement talks. They helped both sides understand that a prolonged court battle would be expensive and traumatic for everyone involved. The city faced the prospect of a jury trial where the damages could be even higher, while the Coleman family wanted to focus on healing rather than years of litigation. The final settlement amount shocked the legal community. $15 million was one of the largest police misconduct settlements in state history, and it sent a clear message about the consequences of racial profiling and excessive force. The settlement included not just monetary compensation, but also mandatory reforms to police training, oversight, and accountability. Rebecca announced that she would donate a significant portion of the settlement to organizations working on police reform and racial justice. She established the Coleman Foundation, which provides legal assistance to victims of police misconduct and supports research into bias in law enforcement. Officer Kevin Nash's 15 minutes of unchecked power cost him everything and changed countless lives forever. Rebecca Coleman transformed her trauma into lasting reform, proving that sometimes justice does prevail when good people refuse to stay silent. Her courage in that gas station parking lot and in every courtroom battle that followed.
Step away from the vehicle. Now.
Is there a problem, officer?
Where'd you get that uniform?
I'm a Navy SEAL. I just came from a ceremony.
You got ID?
Yes. But what am I being detained for?
Hands on the car. Don't argue.
Deputy Sheriff Travis Holbrook had been with the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department for 9 years when he responded to a call that would destroy his life and send him to federal prison for 58 years. He was 34 years old, experienced enough to know better, confident enough to believe his judgment was infallible. One Friday night at a gas station on Highland Avenue, he saw a black man in a Navy uniform and decided it had to be fake. The man was Lieutenant Commander Darius Mitchell, a decorated Navy SEAL with 16 years of service, multiple combat deployments, and medals for extraordinary heroism. What Holbrook did next, ignoring Mitchell's credentials, dismissing his military ID, and arresting a war hero in full dress uniform, would trigger a Pentagon investigation, federal charges, and a trial that exposed 9 years of documented racial profiling. Holbrook's record told a story San Bernardino County had ignored for nearly a decade. 14 complaints over 9 years. 14. Every single one involved people of color. Every single one followed the same pattern. A black family barbecuing in Glen Helen Regional Park. Holbrook demanded permits, threatened citations when they questioned his authority. A Hispanic teenager skateboarding near Victoria Gardens Mall, detained for 40 minutes, backpacks searched without consent. An Asian businessman photographing architecture downtown, questioned about terrorism surveillance. A black college student driving through Rancho Cucamonga, pulled over for driving suspiciously. Car searched, no contraband found. The complaints were documented. The pattern was obvious. But San Bernardino County treated each incident in isolation, never connecting them into what they clearly formed. A deputy who saw people of color in spaces where his biased mind said they didn't belong. Supervisors noted in his evaluations that Holbrook was results-oriented, but sometimes overzealous in community interactions, that he could benefit from additional de-escalation, training, that he should work on cultural sensitivity. But those notes never became consequences. 3 complaints resulted in written reprimands filed away and forgotten. 4 triggered mandatory retraining sessions Holbrook attended but never internalized. 7 were closed with insufficient evidence, despite witness statements. 0 resulted in suspension, demotion, or termination. So Holbrook kept patrolling, kept stopping, kept assuming, and San Bernardino County kept ignoring the pattern until the night Holbrook targeted someone who couldn't be dismissed, someone whose credentials came with Pentagon backing, someone whose arrest would finally force accountability. Lieutenant Commander Darius Mitchell was 38 years old when Deputy Holbrook decided his Navy uniform must be fake. Mitchell had been a Navy SEAL for 16 years. 16 years of service most people can't comprehend. He joined the Navy at 22, desperate to escape San Bernardino's cycle of poverty and violence that had claimed 3 of his high school friends. Basic training at Great Lakes, then BUD/S, basic underwater demolition, SEAL training, where 80% of candidates quit. Mitchell didn't quit. 6 months of hell, cold water immersions, endless physical torture, sleep deprivation designed to break you. He graduated, earned his trident, the gold pin SEALs wear with pride. Then the real work began. First deployment to Iraq in 2009, Ramadi, clearing buildings, hunting high-value targets, watching teammates take fire. Second deployment to Afghanistan, Helmand Province, 8 months in the mountains, ambushes, IEDs, missions classified even now. Third, deployment back to Iraq, Mosul, the fight against ISIS, operations so intense Mitchell still had nightmares. Syria, Yemen, Somalia, places the American public never heard about, missions that never made the news. In 2016, during an operation in northern Iraq, Mitchell's team was ambushed. 8 SEALs pinned down by heavy machine gun fire, RPGs exploding, teammates wounded. Mitchell, already hit by shrapnel, his leg bleeding, ran into the kill zone 3 times, dragging wounded operators to safety. He held a position alone for 12 minutes while the team evacuated, taking fire from 3 directions, returning fire until his ammunition ran out. All 8 teammates survived. Mitchell earned the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration for valor, just below the Medal of Honor. The citation described extraordinary heroism under fire and complete disregard for personal safety. He also earned the Purple Heart for his wounds and the Bronze Star with V device for valor in a separate operation. His chest held ribbons most civilians wouldn't recognize, but every service member respected. Combat Action Ribbon, Iraq Campaign Medal with 4 stars, Afghanistan Campaign Medal, NATO Medal, ribbons representing years of sacrifice. That Friday night in October, Mitchell was driving through San Bernardino in his Navy service dress blue uniform, the formal military attire worn for ceremonies and official functions. He'd just come from Naval Base San Diego, a memorial service for a fallen teammate, a brother killed in a training accident. The service had been emotional, exhausting, a reminder of how many friends Mitchell had buried. He was driving to his mother's house to surprise her, hadn't seen her in 8 months, couldn't tell her where he'd been. Classified deployment, dangerous work. He just wanted to hug her, sleep in his childhood bed, pretend for a weekend that the world wasn't burning. At 10:47 p.m., his fuel light came on. He pulled into the Chevron station on Highland Avenue. The Chevron station on Highland Avenue sits at the intersection where San Bernardino's working-class neighborhoods meet the slightly more affluent areas to the north. It's the kind of 24-hour station that serves late-night shift workers, long-haul truckers, and people just passing through. Bright fluorescent lights, 8 pumps, small convenience store with bulletproof glass at the counter. On a Friday night in October, the station was quiet. Just a few cars, people minding their own business, getting gas, and leaving. At 10:47 p.m., Lieutenant Commander Darius Mitchell pulled his silver Honda Accord into pump number 5. He stepped out, still in his Navy service dress blue uniform. The uniform is unmistakable. Dark navy blue jacket with gold buttons, white shirt underneath, black tie, and matching navy trousers. On his left chest, rows of ribbons in precise military alignment, the Navy cross at the top, its blue and white stripes immediately recognizable to anyone with military knowledge, Purple Heart below that, bronze star with the small bronze V device for valor, campaign medals, service ribbons, each one telling a story of deployment, sacrifice, combat. On his right chest, his gold seal trident, the eagle clutching an anchor, trident, and pistol, the pin every SEAL earns after years of training. His shoulder board showed 2.5 gold stripes, the rank insignia of a lieutenant commander, 04, equivalent to an army major. His military bearing was obvious, the way he stood, shoulders back, head up, the posture drilled into service members through years of training. His shoes were polished. His uniform was immaculate despite the long day. He looked exactly like what he was, a decorated Navy officer in formal military attire. Mitchell swiped his credit card at the pump, selected regular unleaded, and began filling his tank. He was exhausted, emotionally drained from the memorial service, from saying goodbye to another teammate who'd survived combat only to die in a training accident. He was thinking about his mother, about how surprised she'd be to see him, about whether she'd made her famous peach cobbler recently. He wasn't thinking about the person watching him from across the parking lot, someone who saw his uniform, saw his skin, and decided something must be wrong. Before we continue, where are you watching from? If this is your first time here, please hit that subscribe button. Stories like these need to be shared, and your support helps us bring more truth to light. The call came into San Bernardino County Sheriff's Dispatch at 10:51 p.m., anonymous caller, refusing to provide a name, calling from a cell phone that would later be traced to an apartment complex 3 blocks from the Chevron station. "Hi, I'm calling about a suspicious person at the gas station on Highland Avenue. There's a black guy wearing what looks like a military costume, and he's been standing there for a while. He looks threatening. I think he might be impersonating a service member or something. Can you send someone to check it out?" The dispatcher asked standard questions. "Is the person doing anything threatening? Has he approached anyone? Is he carrying weapons?" "No, but he just looks suspicious. The uniform looks fake. I don't think he's really military. He doesn't look like he should be wearing that." The dispatcher logged the call, suspicious person, possible stolen valor, and sent it out. The call was assigned to Deputy Travis Holbrook, who was patrolling 2 miles away. Holbrook responded immediately. This was exactly the kind of call that activated every bias in his pattern. A black man in a space where Holbrook's assumptions said black men didn't belong, wearing something that seemed too legitimate, too accomplished, too authoritative for Holbrook to accept as real. In Holbrook's mind, the narrative was already written before he arrived. Black guy in military uniform at a gas station late at night, probably homeless, probably mentally ill, Probably bought the uniform at a thrift store or online. Stolen valor, impersonating a service member, that's a federal crime. He's going to investigate, probably make an arrest. Another case closed. Holbrook didn't consider that the uniform might be real. He didn't think about calling the base to verify. He didn't wonder why someone impersonating military would wear such an elaborate, expensive, perfectly fitted dress uniform with specific medals and ribbons. He just saw a black man in a military uniform and decided it had to be fake. His bias was so complete, so ingrained after 9 years of targeting people of color without consequences, that evidence didn't matter. His assumptions overrode reality. He pulled into the Chevron station at 10:54 p.m., lights flashing, already approaching this as a criminal matter rather than a welfare check. Mitchell was finishing pumping gas, replacing the nozzle, closing his fuel door, when he saw the patrol car pull in fast, lights swirling red and blue across the concrete. Deputy Holbrook stepped out of his patrol car before it fully stopped, his hand resting on his duty belt near his weapon, his posture aggressive, confrontational. He walked directly toward Mitchell, who was standing next to his Honda, fuel door closed, receipt printing from the pump. Mitchell turned and saw the deputy approaching fast, lights still flashing, and his stomach dropped. He'd been here before, not exactly this situation, but close enough. He knew what was happening. "Step away from the vehicle. Hands where I can see them. Now." Mitchell raised his hands slowly, palms out, visible, non-threatening. His voice was calm, controlled, the tone of someone trained to de-escalate tense situations. "Officer, I'm just getting gas. Is there a problem?" Holbrook stopped 3 feet away, his eyes scanning Mitchell up and down, taking in the uniform, the medals, the insignia, and seeing none of it as real. "Military costume isn't funny. You need to take it off right now." Mitchell's heart sank. He'd served 16 years, deployed to combat zones most Americans couldn't find on a map, earned medals for valor under fire, and he was being told his uniform was a costume. He recognized the tone, the assumption, the accusation. This wasn't about the uniform. This was about his skin. "Officer, this isn't a costume. I'm an active duty Navy SEAL. I just came from a memorial service at Naval Base San Diego. I'm on my way to visit my mother." Holbrook's expression didn't change. "Sure you are. Stolen valor is a federal crime. You're impersonating a military officer." Mitchell felt anger rising but kept his voice steady. 16 years of training, of staying calm under pressure, of controlling his reactions when lives depended on it. "Sir, I'm not impersonating anyone. This is my uniform. I earned it. I can show you my military ID, my orders, anything you need to verify." "I don't need to verify anything. I can see what's happening here." Holbrook stepped closer, his voice harder. "You bought that uniform, put on some fake medals, and now you're walking around pretending to be something you're not. It's disrespectful to real service members." Mitchell's jaw tightened. He'd lost friends in Iraq and Afghanistan. He'd held dying teammates. He'd been wounded saving others. And this deputy was telling him he was disrespecting service members. Other customers at the gas station were starting to notice. A man at pump 3 slowed down, watching. A woman inside the convenience store pressed her face against the glass. Should officers verify military credentials before accusing service members? Drop your answer below. Mitchell reached slowly into his jacket pocket, moving deliberately so Holbrook wouldn't misinterpret the action. "Officer, I'm reaching for my military ID. It's in my inside pocket. I'm going to show you my credentials. Keep your hands where I can see them." Holbrook's hand moved closer to his weapon. Mitchell froze, then moved even slower, pulling out his military ID card, the common access card that every service member carries. He held it out. "This is my military ID. Lieutenant Commander Darius Mitchell, United States Navy. My DoD ID number is right here. You can call Naval Base San Diego. You can call NCIS. You can verify everything." Holbrook took the card, glanced at it for maybe 3 seconds, and handed it back. "Anyone can print a fake ID. They sell them online for $20. Mitchell stared at him. The ID had holograms, security features, An embedded chip, the Department of Defense seal. It was as official as an ID could be. This isn't fake. Look at the security features. Look at the hologram. This is a military common access card. It's impossible to fake convincingly. Looks fake to me. Mitchell pointed to his chest, to the rows of ribbons precisely aligned. These ribbons, these medals, they're in the correct order according to military regulations. The Navy Cross, Purple Heart, Bronze Star with V device. These represent specific awards. You can verify every one of them. Anyone can buy fake medals online. I've seen it before. Holbrook's voice was flat, dismissive. Mitchell's patience was wearing thin, but he kept trying. Sir, I'm asking you to make one phone call. Call the Naval Special Warfare Command duty officer. Call NCIS. They can confirm my identity in 5 minutes. I'm not asking you to take my word. I'm asking you to verify through official channels. I don't need to call anyone. I can tell what's real and what's fake. This was the moment where bias became impenetrable. Holbrook had decided before he arrived that Mitchell was impersonating a service member. Every piece of evidence after that, the ID, the uniform, the medals, the calm demeanor, was filtered through that initial assumption. He wasn't looking at a Navy SEAL. He was looking at a criminal trying to deceive him. The gas station security cameras were recording everything from 2 angles, one mounted above the pumps, one above the convenience store entrance. The footage would later show Mitchell standing calmly, hands visible, speaking in controlled tones. It would show Holbrook aggressive, dismissive, refusing to examine the evidence. Other customers were pulling out their phones now. A man at Pump 7 had his camera up, recording. The woman in the store was filming through the glass. Everyone could see what was happening. A black man in military uniform being accused of impersonating a service member despite showing credentials. Mitchell tried one more time. Officer Holbrook, reading the nameplate, I'm Lieutenant Commander Darius Mitchell. I've served 16 years in the Navy, 12 as a SEAL. I have my military ID, my orders in my car, my leave papers. I'm asking you to verify my credentials before this goes any further. Holbrook's voice turned hard, commanding. Take off that uniform right now. You're not authorized to wear it. Remove it immediately. Mitchell stared at him, processing what was being demanded. Strip out of his dress uniform at a gas station under fluorescent lights with strangers watching? Remove the uniform he'd earned through blood and sacrifice? I'm not stripping out of my dress uniform at a gas station, sir. This is my uniform. I'm authorized to wear it. I'm an active duty officer. That's a direct order. Remove the uniform or I'll remove it for you. Mitchell's voice remained controlled, but the edge was unmistakable. Officer, what you're demanding is unreasonable and unlawful. I'm not removing my uniform. I've shown you my credentials. I've asked you to verify my identity. You're refusing to do basic due diligence. Holbrook reached for his radio. Dispatch, this is 3 Adam 1-2. I need backup at the Chevron station on Highland. Suspect is belligerent, refusing lawful orders, possible stolen valor situation. Mitchell's hands were still raised, visible, non-threatening. His voice carried across the parking lot, clear enough for the recording phones to capture. I am not belligerent. I am not refusing lawful orders. I am a lieutenant commander in the United States Navy, and I'm being unlawfully detained. Holbrook stepped closer, invading Mitchell's space. You're impersonating a military officer? That's a federal crime under the Stolen Valor Act. You're under arrest. The irony was staggering. Holbrook was accusing Mitchell of stolen valor while about to commit deprivation of rights under color of law, false imprisonment, assault on a military service member, multiple federal felonies that would send Holbrook to prison for decades. But Holbrook couldn't see it. His bias was complete. Mitchell took a slow breath, the kind he'd learned in combat when staying calm meant survival. Sir, I've served this country for 16 years. I've deployed to Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. I've been wounded in combat. I've saved lives. I've earned every ribbon on this uniform. I'm not a criminal. I'm asking you one more time to verify my credentials before you make a mistake that destroys your career. Your career is over, buddy. You're going to jail. 2 more patrol cars pulled into the station, Lights flashing, sirens winding down. Deputy Maria Santos and Deputy Jeff Coleman stepped out, assessing the situation. A black man in military uniform, hands raised, calm demeanor. Their colleague aggressive, confrontational. Santos exchanged a glance with Coleman. This didn't look right. Santos approached first. Holbrook, what's the situation? Stolen valor. Subject is impersonating a naval officer, refuses to remove the fake uniform, refuses lawful orders. Santos looked at Mitchell, at the uniform, at the rows of medals that looked expensive, official, precisely arranged. Sir, can you identify yourself? Mitchell's voice was steady, professional. I'm Lieutenant Commander Darius Mitchell, United States Navy SEALs. I showed Deputy Holbrook my military ID. I've asked him repeatedly to verify my credentials through Naval Base San Diego, or NCIS. He's refused. This is an unlawful detention. Coleman stepped closer, examining the uniform more carefully. The ribbons were in correct precedence order. Navy Cross at the top, something you couldn't fake without detailed military knowledge. The trident looked authentic, the weight and quality of real gold. The shoulder boards showed proper rank insignia. Holbrook, did you verify his ID? It's fake. Anyone can see that. Santos pulled out her phone. What base are you assigned to, sir? Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, SEAL Team 3. My commanding officer is Captain Raymond Torres. The duty officer tonight should be Lieutenant Hayes. You can call the quarterdeck. They'll confirm my identity in 2 minutes. Santos started to dial. Holbrook grabbed her arm. We don't need to call. I'm telling you it's fake. Santos pulled her arm away, her expression hardening. Holbrook, if there's any chance he's legitimate, we verify. That's basic procedure. He's not legitimate. He's black. Look at him. You really think he's a Navy SEAL? The words hung in the air, captured by multiple phones, recorded by gas station cameras. The implicit bias made explicit. Santos and Coleman both recoiled. Mitchell closed his eyes briefly. There it was. The truth Holbrook had been dancing around, finally said out loud. Coleman's voice dropped low. Holbrook, what did you just say? But Holbrook was committed now, too deep to back out. I'm arresting him. Subject, turn around, hands behind your back. Mitchell made a decision. He could resist, argue, make this physical, or he could comply, document everything, and let the system that Holbrook represented deal with what came next. He turned around, placing his hands behind his back. I'm complying under protest. I am Lieutenant Commander Darius Mitchell, active duty United States Navy SEAL. This arrest is unlawful. I've committed no crime. I've shown proper identification. I've requested verification through official channels. This is being recorded by multiple witnesses and security cameras. Holbrook pulled out his handcuffs and snapped them on Mitchell's wrists, deliberately tight, the metal cutting into skin. Mitchell winced but said nothing. The handcuffs crushed against his uniform jacket, wrinkling the fabric, pressing the metals into his chest. Santos stood frozen, her phone still in her hand, watching something that felt catastrophically wrong. Coleman's face showed pure horror at what his colleague was doing. Holbrook walked Mitchell toward his patrol car, one hand gripping Mitchell's arm, the other on his duty belt. Mitchell's dress shoes scraped across the concrete. His uniform, immaculate 10 minutes ago, was now wrinkled, disheveled. The ribbons sat askew. His tie was pulled to one side. A decorated war hero, a man who'd earned the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism, being perp-walked across a gas station parking lot like a common criminal. The customers at the gas station erupted. He's really in the military. We saw his ID. Check his credentials. Call the base. This is wrong. He didn't do anything. Officer, you're making a mistake. He showed you his ID. Holbrook ignored them all. Several onlookers had called 911, but the dispatcher said deputies were already on scene. Others felt powerless to intervene with an armed officer. Santos and Coleman stood by their cars, uncertain, conflicted, watching their colleague commit a federal crime. Why do some officers see black men in uniform and assume it's fake? Comment your thoughts. The The drive to the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Station took 11 minutes. Mitchell sat in the back of Holbrook's patrol car, hands cuffed behind him, the metal digging into his wrists. The partition separated him from Holbrook, who drove in silence, probably already writing his arrest report in his head, convinced he'd done good police work. Mitchell stared out the window at the streets he'd grown up on, the neighborhoods he'd escaped through military service, now being driven through them in handcuffs. They arrived at the station at 11:19 p.m. Holbrook pulled into the Sallyport, the secure garage where prisoners are brought in, away from public view. He opened the back door and pulled Mitchell out, walking him through the metal door into the booking area. The booking sergeant on duty was Luis Moreno, a 19-year veteran who'd seen everything, or thought he had. He looked up from his computer as Holbrook walked Mitchell in and froze. A man in Navy service dress blues, full uniform, rows of ribbons on his chest, the Navy cross visible at the top, gold trident on his lapel, hands cuffed behind his back. Moreno stood up slowly. "Holbrook, what the hell did you arrest?" "Stolen valor." Subject was at a gas station impersonating a naval officer, wearing a fake uniform, fake medals. Refused to remove the uniform when ordered. Refused lawful commands. "I'm booking him for impersonating a military officer under federal statute." Moreno walked around his desk, approaching Mitchell, examining the uniform more closely. The ribbons were in perfect order, arranged according to military precedence regulations. The Navy Cross, Navy and Marine Corps Medal, Purple Heart, Bronze Star with the small V device, Defense Meritorious Service Medal, Joint Service Commendation Medal, campaign ribbons from Iraq and Afghanistan. The uniform fit perfectly, tailored, expensive. The shoes were polished to a mirror shine. The trident looked like real gold, not costume jewelry. "Sir, what's your name?" "Lieutenant Commander Darius Mitchell, United States Navy, serial number N4378921. I showed Deputy Holbrook my military ID. I asked him to verify my credentials. He refused." Mitchell's voice was calm but carried the exhaustion of someone who'd been fighting an absurd battle for the past 30 minutes. Moreno held out his hand. "Can I see your ID?" Mitchell nodded toward his jacket pocket. "Inside left pocket." Moreno carefully reached into Mitchell's pocket and pulled out the common access card. He examined it under the bright booking area lights. Hologram intact, embedded security chip visible, Department of Defense seal embossed. Photo matched the man standing in front of him. The ID showed rank, Lieutenant Commander 04, Branch of Service, United States Navy, expiration date 18 months from now. Moreno turned to Holbrook. "This looks real. It's fake. Anyone can print those." Moreno had seen fake military IDs before. They were usually obviously counterfeit, printed on regular cardstock, no security features, wrong fonts. This wasn't that. This had weight, texture, multiple security layers. "Holbrook, this has an RFID chip. You can't fake that." He walked back to his desk and picked up his phone. "What base are you assigned to, Commander?" "Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, SEAL Team 3. Moreno dialed the number for NAB Coronado Quarterdeck, the 24-hour duty station. It rang twice. "Quarterdeck, Petty Officer Hayes speaking. This is a non-secure line. This is Sergeant Moreno, San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. I need to verify the identity of someone claiming to be one of your personnel. Lieutenant Commander Darius Mitchell says he's assigned to SEAL Team 3. There was a pause, the sound of typing. "Stand by, Sergeant." The wait felt like forever, but lasted maybe 90 seconds. Hayes came back on the line, his voice more formal. "Sergeant, I can confirm Lieutenant Commander Darius Mitchell is an active duty officer assigned to Naval Special Warfare Group 1, SEAL Team 3. What's the nature of your inquiry?" Moreno's face went white. "He's been arrested." "Arrested? For what?" "Hold on." Moreno looked at Holbrook, then at Mitchell, then back at Holbrook. "He's real. He's an active duty SEAL Team 3 officer. You arrested a Navy SEAL." Within 6 minutes of that phone call, the situation escalated beyond anything San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department had ever handled. Petty Officer Hayes immediately notified his officer of the deck. The OOD notified the command duty officer. The CDO notified the SEAL Team 3 commanding officer, Captain Raymond Torres, at his home. Torres, knowing Mitchell had been at a memorial service that evening and was heading to visit family, immediately understood something had gone catastrophically wrong. At 11:31 p.m., Torres called the Naval Criminal Investigative Service duty officer in San Diego. "This is Captain Torres, SEAL Team 3. One of my officers, Lieutenant Commander Darius Mitchell, has been arrested by San Bernardino County Sheriff. I need NCIS involved immediately." The NCIS agent, Special Agent Kellerman, pulled up Mitchell's service record on his computer as Torres spoke. Combat deployments, Navy Cross, Purple Heart, active security clearance, 0 disciplinary issues. "Captain, what are the charges?" "Unknown, but he was in dress blues heading to visit his mother. Whatever happened, this needs federal attention. NCIS notified Naval Special Warfare Command Headquarters. NSW Command has a direct line to the Pentagon for situations involving special operations personnel." By 11:47 p.m., the duty officer at the Pentagon's Naval Operations Center was briefed. A Navy SEAL, decorated combat veteran, arrested in California under unclear circumstances. This wasn't a local matter anymore. At 12:03 a.m., Navy JAG, Judge Advocate General's Corps, attorneys at Naval Base San Diego were activated. 2 senior military lawyers began preparing to drive to San Bernardino. Pentagon public affairs officers were notified, preparing for what could become a national story. At 12:15 a.m., Captain Torres personally called Sheriff Robert Decker at home. Decker, roused from sleep, listened as Torres explained, with barely controlled anger, that one of his officers, a decorated SEAL with 16 years of exemplary service, had been arrested at a gas station for wearing his uniform. "Sheriff, Lieutenant Commander Mitchell holds a top-secret, sensitive compartmented information clearance. He's been on classified deployments. He's earned the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism, and one of your deputies arrested him for stolen valor. I have Navy JAG en route. I have NCIS involved. And I'm about to notify the Secretary of the Navy that one of my SEALs was arrested for being black in uniform." Decker's blood went cold. He immediately called the station, demanded the watch commander brief him. The watch commander pulled the booking information, saw Mitchell's name, saw the charges, saw that Sergeant Moreno had already verified Mitchell's military status. Decker arrived at the station by 12:40 a.m., still in civilian clothes, his face showing the horror of someone who just realized his department had committed an unthinkable error. He walked into the booking area where Mitchell still stood, hands now uncuffed, uniform wrinkled, but dignity intact. "Commander Mitchell, I'm Sheriff Decker. I cannot adequately apologize for what's happened. You're being released immediately. All charges are dropped." Mitchell's voice was quiet, controlled. "Sheriff, your deputy arrested a decorated military officer at a gas station for wearing his uniform. He refused to verify my credentials. He demanded I strip out of my dress blues in public. He handcuffed me in front of witnesses. This isn't something an apology fixes." Decker nodded, his face pale. "I understand, sir. We'll conduct a full investigation." "The Pentagon is already conducting their investigation, Sheriff. This is out of your hands now." While Mitchell stood in the booking area waiting for the sheriff to process his release, his complete service record was being pulled up on computer screens from San Diego to Washington, D.C. Every deployment, every mission, every award, every evaluation was being reviewed by Navy leadership, NCIS investigators, Pentagon officials, and within hours, the U.S. Attorney's Office. The record painted a picture that made Holbrook's arrest not just wrong, but obscene. Darius Mitchell had enlisted in the Navy at 22 years old, scored high enough on the ASVAB to qualify for any rating, chose to attempt BUD-S training. He'd survived Hell Week, the infamous 5.5 days of continuous training with maximum 4 hours of sleep total. He'd survived the pool competency tests where instructors tried to drown you to test your calm under pressure. He'd survived the cold, the pain, the instructors designed to break you. 78% of his class quit. Mitchell graduated, earned his trident, became a Navy SEAL. First deployment came in 2009. Iraq, Ramadi, and Fallujah. Clearing buildings, hunting high-value targets, combat operations that lasted months. Second deployment, Afghanistan. Helmand Province, 2011. Hunting Taliban commanders in the mountains. 8 months of firefights and IED threats. Third deployment, back to Iraq in 2014. Mosul, fighting ISIS. Operations so intense the casualty rate for his platoon was 40%. Fourth deployment, Syria, 2016. Classified operations against ISIS leadership. Fifth deployment, Yemen, 2018. Counter-terrorism missions the American public never heard about. Sixth deployment, back to Afghanistan, 2019. Training Afghan special forces while conducting direct action missions. 6 combat deployments over 12 years as a SEAL. Most Americans serve 1 deployment their entire career. Mitchell had 6. In 2016, during an operation outside Mosul, Mitchell's 8-man SEAL team was ambushed while securing a compound. Heavy machine gun fire from 3 directions, RPGs exploding, walls collapsing. 2 teammates were hit immediately, wounded, unable to move. Mitchell, already hit by shrapnel in his left leg, bleeding, his uniform soaked with blood, ran into the kill zone. He dragged the